Sarah had always prided herself on her ability to manage her finances carefully. For years, she had worked as a teacher, saving as much as she could for her retirement. When she finally retired at the age of 56, she had moved into a modest but comfortable senior housing community in Florida. The apartment was small but cozy, and for the first time in decades, Sarah felt like she could truly relax. She had planned every detail of her retirement, including her monthly budget, making sure her living expenses wouldn't exceed her pension, but everything changed the day President Trump announced his decision to raise housing costs for senior citizens. Sarah had been sitting in her favorite armchair, sipping on her afternoon tea when she heard the news flash on the television. Senior citizens will be facing higher housing costs as part of the new policy, the reporter's voice echoed. This increase is expected to affect pensioners living in subsidized housing programs. Sarah paused, her cup halfway to her lips. Her heart sank as she listened further, her mind racing. The subsidized housing program she depended on for her rent had just been cut. Her monthly rent, which had always been manageable, was now set to rise. Sarah had never anticipated such an increase. The news felt like a punch to the gut. She had already been living on a fixed income, her pension, supplemented by small savings, had always been enough to get by. But now, with the cost of her housing rising, she was facing an uncertain future. How much would her rent increase? What would she have to sacrifice to keep up with the new costs? She quickly dialed the housing office for her community, her hands trembling slightly as she held the phone. The receptionist, a polite woman who had always been kind to Sarah, answered after a few rings. "Good afternoon, how may I help you?" "Hi, this is Sarah from Unit 27. I heard about the housing cost increases, and I was wondering if you could give me more details on how this will affect my rent." There was a brief silence on the other end before the receptionist responded. "Yes, Mrs. Sarah, we've just been informed. The changes will take effect next month. Unfortunately, your monthly rent will increase by 15%. We are still finalizing the details, but you should receive a formal notice soon." Sarah felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. 15%. That was more than she could afford. Her rent was already a significant part of her budget, and this increase would push her expenses well beyond what she could comfortably manage. "Thank you," Sarah replied, her voice tight with worry. She hung up the phone and sat in silence for a few moments, the reality of the situation sinking in. She had lived in this apartment for over 5 years, and it had become her sanctuary. But now, it seemed like even that was being taken away. She opened her laptop and pulled up her budget sheet, something she had used for years to keep track of her finances. It was always simple, easy to follow. Now, however, the numbers didn't add up. With the increase in rent, she would have to adjust her spending drastically. "How much will I have to cut back?" she whispered to herself. She looked over her expenses: utilities, groceries, transportation, medical bills, and the occasional outing with her friends. Each of these categories had already been pared down as much as possible, and now, she would have to make even more sacrifices. The thought of cutting back on her few remaining pleasures, her weekly yoga class, her occasional trips to the local cafe for a treat, felt unbearable. The increase in rent wasn't just about money, it was about her sense of security. Sarah had always lived modestly, but she had done so with the belief that her basic needs would be met in her later years. Now, that belief felt shaken. That night, as she lay in bed, the weight of the news pressed on her chest. The rent increase was more than just a financial burden, it was a stark reminder of how fragile her situation had become. What if this was just the beginning? What if more cuts came in the future? She had never expected retirement to be this stressful. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to push the worries from her mind, but they kept creeping back in. She had worked hard all her life, paid into the system, and followed the rules. She never imagined that, at this stage in her life, she would have to worry about something as basic as affording a roof over her head. And yet, here she was, anxious, uncertain, and unsure of where to turn next. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would she have to move? Would she be forced to ask her children for help? Or would she find a way to manage, to make ends meet, and hold on to the life she had so carefully built. The uncertainty felt like a storm cloud hanging over her, and she didn't know how long she could keep waiting for the sky to clear. The days following the news of the rent increase felt like a blur. Sarah went through the motions of her daily routine, but everything felt different. She had never imagined that the comfort of her retirement would be so fragile, so easily upended by a decision made in Washington, D.C. Each day brought a new set of challenges. The rent was due in 2 weeks, and Sarah had already started mentally calculating how much she could afford to pay. She had trimmed the fat from her budget as much as possible, no more eating out, no more trips to the movies, and the occasional yoga class she enjoyed every Wednesday had become a luxury she simply couldn't afford. But with the new increase in her rent, it wasn't enough. She had been careful about her savings, always knowing that, as a retiree, she would need to live within her means. But now, the weight of her financial situation was pushing down on her chest, making every breath feel heavier. One afternoon, Sarah walked to the community center in her neighborhood, hoping that perhaps someone could offer guidance. She had heard about a financial aid program for seniors, and maybe they could help her with the rent. It wasn't a guaranteed solution, but Sarah was willing to try anything at this point. As she approached the center, the sun beat down on her, the warmth of the Florida afternoon seeming to mock the cool anxiety that clung to her. Inside the community center, there was a small group of seniors gathered around a table, chatting and reading through flyers. Sarah stepped up to the counter where a volunteer, an older woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, was sitting. "Hello," Sarah said, trying to muster a smile. "I was wondering if you could help me with something. I'm a senior on a fixed income, and my rent just went up unexpectedly. I'm not sure what to do next." The volunteer looked up, her face softening with sympathy as she nodded. "I'm sorry to hear that, dear. That's been happening to a lot of people lately. It's tough. Have you looked into the local assistance programs? There are a few options, but you'll need to fill out an application, and it can take some time for approval." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. "I didn't know about these programs. What kind of help do they offer?" "Well," the volunteer began, "there's one program that can help with rent. And others that assist with utilities and medical expenses. But there's always paperwork, you know how it is. We can give you the forms, but you'll need to have your financial information ready, income statements, proof of your Social Security payments, that sort of thing." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath. "I understand. I'll fill them out right away." The volunteer handed her a stack of forms, and as Sarah flipped through them, she realized how much she would need to provide. The documents seemed endless: proof of identity, income verification, bank statements, and even proof of her age. It was overwhelming, but she knew this was her best shot at making things work. "Don't worry, dear," the volunteer said, noticing Sarah's hesitation. "It seems like a lot, but once you get everything together, it should be fine. We've helped many people in your situation." "Thank you," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll get this filled out and turn it in as soon as I can." Leaving the community center, Sarah felt a mixture of hope and dread. The prospect of waiting for approval, and the uncertainty of whether she would even qualify for assistance, was enough to make her feel as if the walls were closing in. She had worked hard her entire life, and now, it seemed like the future she had planned for was slipping away with each passing day. That evening, as Sarah sat in her small apartment, she looked at the stack of paperwork on her table and wondered if she would ever find peace again. The rent was due, the bills were piling up. And the safety net she had always relied on was no longer there. She had worked hard all her life, paid into the system, and now it felt as though everything she had built was being torn down. She had been proud of her independence, but now it was starting to feel like a curse. She had always managed on her own, but this was different. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with careful budgeting and planning. This was bigger. This was a system that no longer seemed to work for her, a reality that she hadn't prepared for. Sarah picked up the phone again, this time dialing the number for her daughter, Emily, who lived several states away. She had avoided calling her for the past few weeks, not wanting to worry her, but tonight, the weight of everything was too much. She needed someone to talk to, someone who would understand. "Hi, Mom," Emily answered, her voice warm and comforting. "How are you doing?" Sarah hesitated before answering. She had wanted to say fine, but the truth was, she wasn't. "Emily, I'm not doing well. My rent just went up, and I'm not sure how I'm going to manage. I've been trying to figure things out on my own, but I think I need help." There was a long pause before Emily spoke, her voice tinged with concern. "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner? We can figure this out together. I know it's hard to ask for help, but you don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she felt the release she had been holding back for so long. The weight of the situation, the stress, and the fear of losing her independence finally broke through. "I don't want to be a burden to you, Emily. I've always been able to take care of myself." "I know you have, Mom," Emily replied gently. "But this isn't about being a burden. It's about us taking care of each other. I want to help." For the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to feel something other than anxiety. She let out a shaky breath, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling the warmth of her daughter's words wash over her. "Thank you for being there." As the conversation continued, Sarah realized that while her situation was far from resolved, she wasn't facing it alone. She had a daughter who cared, and that meant everything. Weeks passed since Sarah had begun the process of applying for assistance programs, but still, her financial worries mounted. Each day seemed to blend into the next, the quiet routine of her retirement now interrupted by constant reminders of how precarious her situation had become. The community housing office had assured her that they were processing her request, but Sarah knew that waiting for government assistance was like waiting for the tide to turn, a slow, often disappointing process. The rent was now due, and the anxiety of the rising cost weighed heavily on her. The increase, though seemingly small to others, was significant for Sarah, living on a fixed income. Her pension, though modest, had been sufficient when she had first retired, but with the rent increase, her carefully planned budget had been thrown off course. Each bill she opened now felt like another obstacle, another piece of her life slipping through her fingers. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on not needing to ask for help. But now, even with the application for assistance in progress, Sarah found herself struggling more than ever. Her savings, once her safety net, were dwindling quickly, and there was no telling how long it would take for her benefits to arrive. The slow, grinding weight of uncertainty began to press on her each day, leaving her feeling physically and emotionally exhausted. One afternoon, Sarah found herself standing in the middle of her small living room, staring at the pile of unopened bills that had accumulated on the table. She had tried to avoid looking at them, but now, they seemed impossible to ignore. The rent increase, the overdue utility bills, and the reminder of the upcoming property taxes, it all felt overwhelming. The number on her pension check wasn't enough anymore. Her phone rang, snapping her from her thoughts. It was Megan, her daughter. Sarah had tried to keep her updated, but she hadn't wanted to burden her too much. But today, as the weight of her situation pressed down on her, Sarah realized she had no choice but to open up. "Hey, Mom." Megan's voice was warm, as always. But there was something in her tone that Sarah immediately picked up on. Her daughter knew. She could tell from the way Megan spoke that she could sense the worry in her mother's voice. "Hi, sweetheart," Sarah replied, trying to sound cheerful, though it was a struggle. "How's everything on your end?" "Oh, busy as usual," Megan said, her voice light but with a hint of concern. "But I've been thinking about you a lot lately. Have you heard back from that assistance program you applied for?" Sarah swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "I haven't heard anything yet, but I'm hoping soon. The paperwork is all in, and they said it could take a few more weeks to process." "Mom," Megan began, her voice softening, "I know it's hard, but you don't have to do this alone. Have you looked at any other options? Maybe we can help out, just temporarily, until you get everything sorted." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had never wanted to ask Megan for help, never wanted to feel like she was imposing on her daughter. But now, in this moment, she realized that her pride had been holding her back from doing what was necessary. She wasn't just struggling financially, she was struggling emotionally, too. The weight of managing everything alone was becoming unbearable. "Megan, I don't want to be a burden on you," Sarah said, her voice cracking slightly. "You have your own family, your own responsibilities. I don't want to add to that." "Mom," Megan replied firmly, "you are not a burden. I want to help. I can help with the rent, at least for the next couple of months. We'll figure it out together, okay? You don't have to carry this by yourself." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she sat down on the couch, overwhelmed by the kindness in Megan's words. For so long, she had convinced herself that asking for help would mean giving up, admitting that she couldn't handle things on her own. But now, in her daughter's voice, she heard not just concern, but love, unconditional. Unwavering love. "I don't know what to say, Meg," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Thank you. I don't know how I'd make it through this without you." Megan's voice softened. "You don't have to thank me, Mom. We're family. We stick together. We'll get through this, I promise." Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the weight of her emotions, the relief that washed over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope that things might get better, that there was still a chance to move forward, even with the challenges ahead. The conversation ended with Megan assuring Sarah that they would go over her finances together when she came to visit next week. Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her, the fear of financial ruin slightly eased by the knowledge that she wasn't alone in this struggle anymore. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, Sarah looked at the pile of bills again. But this time, it wasn't the same overwhelming wave of dread that washed over her. She wasn't facing it alone anymore. Megan had reached out, and Sarah had allowed herself to accept the help. It was a hard lesson, but one that she now understood. Sometimes, letting others in wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. The days following Sarah's conversation with Megan felt like a heavy mix of relief and guilt. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a weight lifted off her shoulders, at least for a little while. Megan had offered to help with the rent, and though Sarah had reluctantly accepted, there was still a lingering feeling of discomfort. She had never wanted to rely on anyone else, especially not her daughter. But as she sat in her small apartment, the quiet of the afternoon wrapping around her like a blanket, Sarah realized that sometimes, it was okay to ask for help, but the relief wasn't without its complexities. The rent wasn't the only financial burden on Sarah's shoulders. She had always been frugal, making sure to live within her means and save for the future. Yet, now it felt as though every step she took, every move she made, was a battle against a system that wasn't designed to support people like her. Her pension, which had once seemed like a steady lifeline, was now barely enough to cover basic living expenses. Let alone the unexpected costs that had popped up. She stared at the pile of unopened bills again, medical expenses, utilities, the credit card statement that had been quietly accumulating interest, and the sense of dread returned. The weight of financial strain wasn't just a matter of paying bills anymore, it was an ongoing, daily mental battle. How could she continue to live this way, knowing that every month was going to feel like a scramble? Her health wasn't improving either. The back pain she'd been dealing with for years had become more acute. She had been to the doctor a few times, but with rising copays and medical expenses, she had postponed her next appointment. Her body felt like it was betraying her, a constant reminder that retirement wasn't going to be the peaceful, relaxing time she had envisioned. Instead, it was a time filled with worry, discomfort, and an overwhelming sense of financial instability. One evening, Sarah found herself pacing back and forth in her living room, unable to sit still. She had always been able to handle stress, but lately, it felt like she was drowning in it. She needed to find a solution. She couldn't keep relying on Megan to bail her out. It wasn't just the rent, it was everything. Her independence, her ability to manage her own life, was slipping through her fingers, and the thought of asking for more help, even from Megan, made her heart heavy. She stopped pacing and looked out the window at the neighborhood beyond. The sun had begun to set, casting a soft orange glow over the houses. It was beautiful, calming, even, but Sarah felt detached from it. The world outside seemed so peaceful, so effortless, while her own world was a whirlwind of anxiety and fear. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was another email from the housing office. She hesitated before opening it, already anticipating more bad news. But this time, the email wasn't about her rent or the ongoing delays. It was a notice about a community event, an informational meeting about financial assistance programs for seniors. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the answer she was looking for? A chance to gather more resources? It was a long shot, but it was something. She quickly wrote down the time and date of the meeting and made a mental note to attend. It wasn't a guaranteed solution, but at least it was an opportunity to explore more options. For the first time in a while, Sarah felt a spark of hope, however small it might be. She knew that she couldn't continue down this path of uncertainty. Something had to change. That night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about her past. When she was younger, she had dreamed of this time in her life, the time when she could relax, enjoy the fruits of her labor, and not worry about making ends meet. But as the years passed, things didn't turn out quite as she had imagined. Retirement was supposed to be a break from the grind. But now it felt like a constant battle to stay afloat. She pulled the covers up around her shoulders and closed her eyes. The exhaustion of the day had caught up with her, and despite the worries that still clung to her, she drifted into a restless sleep. The challenges of the day had worn her down, but she knew that tomorrow would bring a new opportunity, an opportunity to find another way forward. She couldn't keep fighting this battle alone. She had to rely on more than just her own strength. The next morning, Sarah woke up earlier than usual. She had tossed and turned all night, her mind restless with worries. The meeting she had signed up for, the one about financial assistance for seniors, kept replaying in her head. As she lay there, the thought that had been creeping into her mind for days finally became clear. What if it wasn't enough? She could hear the faint hum of traffic outside her window, a reminder of the busy world beyond her small apartment. But within her walls, everything felt heavy, and the noise from the outside world only made her feel more isolated. She had always believed in her ability to handle her own affairs, but now, the weight of the bills, the rising costs, and the constant uncertainty made her question everything she had worked for. The letter from the housing office still sat on her kitchen table, unopened. Sarah had read the first part over and over, rent increase. But now, she wasn't sure if attending the community meeting would really help. Was there a point to any of this? Was it even possible to go back to the life she had once known? Where retirement meant peace and relaxation? Or was she now caught in a system that only seemed to push her further into a corner? She stood up from bed and walked to the window, gazing out at the morning sky. The Florida sun was bright, casting long shadows over the street below. She could see a few elderly neighbors walking their dogs or sitting on their porches, enjoying the morning. It seemed so simple, so easy for them. How was it that Sarah, who had always been in control, now felt like she was teetering on the edge? Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Megan. Are you still going to the meeting today? I know it's tough, but remember, you're not alone in this. We'll get through it together. A wave of gratitude washed over Sarah, but with it came a painful reality. Even with Megan's help, the financial burden was hers to bear. She could ask for help, but the problem would still remain. She would still be the one navigating the confusing maze of bureaucracy and mounting bills. She would still be the one wondering how long she could keep this up before everything crumbled. Sarah's stomach twisted in knots. She felt trapped, caught between wanting to preserve her independence and knowing, deep down, that she couldn't keep going like this. The more she thought about it, the more she felt the suffocating weight of doubt. Was it really worth it to keep fighting this battle? That afternoon, Sarah forced herself to go to the community meeting. She had signed up, she had to at least show up and see what options were available. As she walked into the community center, she was greeted by the sight of a small group of elderly people gathered in a circle. They all seemed calm, even content, as they spoke with one of the volunteers about the assistance programs. Sarah found a seat near the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The meeting began, and the speaker, a well-dressed woman in her 40s, started outlining the different programs that were available for seniors facing financial difficulty. It all sounded promising: help with rent, food assistance, utilities. But as the woman spoke, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that nothing would really change. She had heard all these promises before. What was the point of attending if it was just going to be another round of paperwork, more waiting, more uncertainty? As the meeting continued, Sarah found herself zoning out. The faces of the people around her, all of them older than she was, seemed so resigned. They nodded along to the speaker's words, but Sarah couldn't help but notice that there was a quiet sense of hopelessness in the air. Was this what her future would look like? Endless forms to fill out, endless waiting for assistance that may never come. The meeting ended after an hour, and Sarah gathered her things, feeling more lost than when she had arrived. She hadn't found any immediate solutions, and the people she had spoken with didn't seem any more confident than she did. They all looked like they had been stuck in this cycle for years, hoping that the system would eventually come through for them, but none of them seemed to believe it would. Walking back to her apartment, Sarah felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The questions she had tried to avoid flooded her mind. What happens if the assistance doesn't come through? What happens if the rent keeps rising? How much longer can I live like this? As she walked through the front door of her apartment, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The fear of losing her home was real, and now, it wasn't just a vague worry, it was something tangible. The thought of asking Megan for more help made her stomach churn. She didn't want to depend on her daughter, she didn't want to be a burden. But the truth was, Sarah wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going like this. That evening, Sarah sat in the dim light of her living room, the quietness around her only amplifying the doubts in her mind. She had tried everything she could, and still, she was no closer to a solution. The systems that were supposed to help her had become a maze of bureaucracy and delays. She had no clear path forward. And the uncertainty of it all felt suffocating. For the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to truly confront the question that had been lurking in the back of her mind: what if this was all too much? The next morning, the Florida sun streamed through the window, but Sarah couldn't shake the dark cloud hanging over her. It had been a restless night, filled with more doubts and questions than answers. She had barely slept, her mind racing with everything she still had to face. The bills, the rising costs, the never-ending wait for assistance, all of it had piled up on her shoulders, making her feel as though she were sinking. But today, something was different. When Sarah woke up, she felt an unexpected sense of clarity. The weight of the past few days had been heavy, but as the sun warmed her small apartment, she felt a strange surge of determination. She couldn't let the fear take over anymore. The uncertainty of the future was real, but she had been through tough times before. Maybe now, it was time to stop worrying and take a more proactive approach. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence in the room. It was an email from the community housing office. Her heart raced as she clicked it open, half expecting more bad news. But this time, it was different. It was an update on the status of her application for financial assistance. Dear Ms. Sarah, the email began, we are pleased to inform you that your application for housing assistance has been approved for temporary relief. Your rent increase will be offset for the next 3 months, and additional resources will be provided to help with your utilities. Please visit the office at your earliest convenience to finalize the paperwork. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She read the email again, making sure it wasn't a mistake. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. The relief was temporary, yes, but it was enough to give her a breather, enough to let her breathe for a moment and get her footing back. With shaking hands, Sarah put the phone down and closed her eyes. The feeling of relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced with a deep, lingering sense of gratitude. This wasn't a long-term fix, but it was enough to keep her afloat. It was a lifeline thrown just in time. The next few hours were a whirlwind. Sarah dressed quickly and made her way to the community office. As she walked down the familiar hallways, she felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. It wasn't often that she had good news to share with others, and today felt like a small victory. At the office, the receptionist greeted her with a warm smile. "Ms. Sarah, we've been expecting you. Congratulations on your approval. We'll get everything finalized for you right away." Sarah smiled, grateful for the calm professionalism that the office staff had always shown. She signed the papers, and the process, though still tedious, felt more manageable now. It wasn't the permanent solution she had hoped for, but it was a start. When she left the office, the world outside seemed just a little brighter. The street was bustling with people, but for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt connected to the world again. She wasn't alone in her struggle. There were people out there, volunteers, social workers, and even strangers, who cared enough to make a difference in her life. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. As she walked back to her apartment, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, but now, there was a clear path forward. She could manage for the next few months. She could take a step back, breathe, and plan what came next. She would keep looking for other resources, continue to pursue the assistance she needed, and maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make her new reality work. That evening, Sarah sat in her favorite armchair, staring out at the peaceful neighborhood street. The sun had set, and the sky was painted with soft pinks and purples. The quiet was soothing, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah allowed herself to truly relax. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Megan. "Mom, I'm so proud of you. I know it's been tough, but I'm glad you're getting some help. We're in this together, okay?" Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she read the message. It was a simple note, but it was all she needed to feel the connection that had been missing for so long. She wasn't facing this alone anymore. She didn't have to carry the weight on her shoulders by herself. Megan's support, the community's help, and the temporary relief from her rent had given Sarah something she hadn't had in a long time: peace of mind. She didn't know what the future held, and she certainly didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt hopeful. She wasn't powerless. She had options, and the strength to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The days following Sarah's approval for temporary relief passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and small victories. The weight on her shoulders had lightened, but it had not disappeared entirely. She had a few months to figure things out, but the underlying uncertainty remained. The future was still a vast unknown. And the questions that had plagued her for months were far from resolved. Still, Sarah wasn't the same person she had been when the news of the rent increase first hit. There was a new clarity in her mind, a quiet strength she had rediscovered after the chaos of the past few weeks. She had learned that even in the face of adversity, there were still options, still ways to make things work. The community had rallied around her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a safety net. That Saturday, Sarah decided to take a walk in the park near her apartment. It had been a while since she had taken the time to enjoy the little things. The sun was warm, and the park was filled with families and children playing. The fresh air felt good on her skin, and she couldn't remember the last time she had taken a moment to simply exist without the weight of financial stress constantly hovering over her. As she strolled along the path, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. The application for assistance, the unexpected relief, the countless nights of worrying that had led her to this moment. She thought about the day she had first received the letter about the rent increase. How small and powerless she had felt. And now, she could feel the slow return of her confidence. She had taken control of her situation, and though the future still seemed uncertain, she now knew that she had the strength to face whatever came next. Halfway through the park, Sarah sat down on a bench beneath a large oak tree. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peaceful sounds of the park wash over her. Birds chirped in the trees, children's laughter echoed in the distance, and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze reminded her that life was still moving forward, regardless of her personal struggles. It was then that she realized how much she had been holding back. She had spent so much time trying to maintain control, trying to keep everything together on her own, that she had forgotten the most important lesson of all: it was okay to need others. It was okay to ask for help, to accept support when it was offered. That was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. Strength didn't mean doing everything alone, it meant knowing when to lean on others and when to admit that you couldn't carry the burden by yourself. A few hours later, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, reviewing her finances once again. The temporary relief had given her breathing room, but she knew that she couldn't rely on it forever. She needed a more permanent solution. She needed to find a way to adjust her lifestyle, to make her finances work for her, and to ensure that she wouldn't face another crisis like this again. Sarah pulled out the spreadsheet she had been working on for weeks, her budget, her savings, her expenses. She had spent so many hours trying to calculate her way out of this mess, but now she saw things differently. She wasn't trying to calculate a perfect solution, she was trying to create a plan that would keep her grounded. No matter what happened. It wasn't about finding a quick fix, it was about building a sustainable future, one step at a time. That evening, Sarah called Megan to update her on the progress. Megan's voice was filled with warmth and relief when she heard the news. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," Megan said. "You've made it through the hardest part. Now we can start making plans for the future. You've got this." Sarah smiled, feeling the weight in her chest lighten just a little. "Thanks, sweetie. I've learned a lot these past few weeks. I'm not as alone as I thought I was." As she ended the call, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The choice to ask for help had been difficult. But it had opened up a new chapter in her life. She wasn't alone. She had a daughter who loved her, a community that supported her, and the strength within herself to face whatever came next. Sarah knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be struggles, still moments of doubt, but she also knew that she had the tools to navigate them. The uncertainty about her future hadn't gone away, but she was no longer paralyzed by it. She had made it through the hardest part. And now, she was ready for the next step.